Doug, bring your hand.
I'm Joe Linehan, and I'm an alcoholic. My sobriety date is October 7th, 1972, and I'm as grateful as I know how to be for that period of time. I didn't have one wrinkle when I started sponsoring Steve. Had a good, strong back, you know. Steve says, I don't want anything, but he told everybody on the planet, hey, I'm turning 50 here as well. You don't make a big deal out of it, but, that's kind of the way we are, But I was just thinking of, this is Alcoholics Anonymous. There's a lot of energy in the room. There's a lot of laughter. Reunited family that's been crippled for years. Different things come together. That's Alcoholics Anonymous, Now, in Steve's case, it took 50 years to get them all gathered up. Sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly, But I was supposed to tell in a general way what I was like, what happened, and what I'm like now. I think that we were talking about it earlier. I think the hardest thing to talk about is what happened. I don't really know what happened. The day came and something touched me where I'd never been touched before, and I knew that this was the day for me to stop drinking. And that thought terrified me. The only sense of ease and comfort I'd ever experienced in life came from alcohol. And people say, why don't you stop? If they knew how I felt when I was sober, they wouldn't ask me to stop. But, the next thought I had was, there's no way I can stop. And I think that's exactly when I was touched for certain, because I knew in my heart of hearts that I was beat. I'm down, I'm out, I'm not coming back, and haven't had a drink since. It's strange, if I get the right job, the right woman, the right car, the right clothes, all those things come together, I can stop drinking, But the minute that I knew that I couldn't ever stop drinking, it's that paradox, I haven't had a drink since. Thank God to Alcoholics Anonymous and people like Steve Mitchell. They'll go a mile further, stay an hour later. And we're talking about people that leave Alcoholics Anonymous, and I think I told a little lady the other day, and she was tore up. She'd been sober a good while and had gotten drunk and been drunk for a good period of time. And she said, well, I was sober for 16 years. I don't remember the date exactly. And she said, I got drunk. And I said, it's my belief, and this is just my belief, that you were never in Alcoholics Anonymous. And I believe that because I truly believe in my heart of hearts that Alcoholics Anonymous is a manner of living and a way of life. How can you walk away from that? How can you possibly walk away from that? I've seen people come through horrendous things and stand up straight and take it head on. We get the tools, Well, that's enough of that mushy stuff, and I'm not talking about that anymore either. Julie, St. Julie. Can you imagine living with that? I mean, it's Steve. It's not there. I always think about this all the time. I mean, I don't know about you all, but when I first got sober, I knew two emotions. I was either elated or I was depressed. Now, I get that, but it took a millisecond to get from one to the other, Can you imagine living with a human being like that, with come in whistling, and the next thing you know, they're flipping furniture upside down? But that's, that's untreated alcoholism. I was the youngest of three. I always said I was the only child. I thought I was the only child. I had two older sisters, and my mother treated me entirely different. She did my two sisters, and why, and that came about, I have no idea. But I was rotten from day one. I was telling the story. I was like 4 years old, and my mother comes home, and I've got the babysitter cornered up in the kitchen, and I'm chunking canned goods at her. And honest to God, that's what my mother said. I don't know whether to whip you or my son. I mean, at 4 years old, come on. But anyway, that was kind of the way things began. Life was really outstanding as far as I could tell up until about the first grade, about 6 years old. And right there, I began to see me as I saw me, and then I saw you as you were, and I became envious. I began to build up whatever that is that made me totally inferior, feel so inadequate. I was telling the guy, I traded with a guy at the clothing store, and his clothing store is right next door to where my first home in Edmond was. And I said, I can remember the first lie that I remember telling. I'm sure it wasn't the first, but the first one I remember telling is there was a playground right across the street from the store, and I was playing with a bunch of kids. And they said, "Hey, Joe, there's a pickup backed up to your house there." I said, "Oh, I know." I said, "We're getting a new TV." We'd never had a TV, And I got home, and sure enough, my mother had found this installment plan and bought this TV, so it really wasn't a lie. I remember I had a buddy that's family was pretty well-to-do, and he asked me if I wanted to go to the lake with him. They had a brand new, great big, beautiful Pontiac and a brand new, beautiful boat. And we were at some little filling station over in eastern Oklahoma, and I'm standing there by that boat, and the guy came up, and he said, "Nice rig." A total stranger. I said, "Yeah, we just got it." Now, that's a sick individual that has to impress somebody he'll never see again. I mean, I haven't had a drink yet. Think about it. I'm prepared. I'm getting there. At 15 years old, some older guy said, "Hey, Joe, you want to go out Friday night and do a little drinking?" I'd never done that before. And I said, "Sure." I wanted to be part of something. We go out there on Old Country Road, they open up a beer and hand it to me, and they'd start drinking, and they're giggling and carrying on, and I take a drink, and I thought, my God, that's the nastiest stuff I've ever done. They said, "What do you think?" And I said, "Oh, this is great. This is great." And I didn't drink all that much, but something happened to me that didn't happen to those other boys. And, it went off like a stick of dynamite. I can feel it right now. That warm tingling glow shot through my body. That cloud of fear that had followed me my entire life just kind of went off in the distance. I didn't feel inferior. I didn't feel inadequate. I'm ready to go. And, I'd always loved women. Just something about women just... It's always been a problem. Still is, matter of fact. But I go to those teenage dances, and the girls are over here and the boys over here, and they're playing music. I'd look at those girls, and I think, whoa. And I'd say, I need to ask her to dance, well, she'll turn me down, so I wouldn't do it. I was scared to death of rejection. I was scared to death that they, But that night, they took me to the little drive-in downtown Edmond, Oklahoma. And I went down through that drive-in, and 15 years of lust came out. I didn't have time to beat around the bush. I just came right at it, I told them exactly what I was interested in, Didn't have much luck, and so when I started back through that drive-in, I just decided I'd fight every man in there. Can you go back with me and just remember that freedom, that sense of ease and comfort? But 90% of that was here. They said, took me home. I got in bed. I was staying with my sister, and I laid down there in that bed, and I'm kind of thinking about the night. I thought, man, I can't believe that. That's cool. That's all right. And all of a sudden, that bed did something it'd never done before. It went, and I thought, oh my God. About the time I got my breath, it took off. And I've never been so sick in my life. You've heaved when you pass a green bean through your sinuses. I'm telling you. That takes some work right there, I'm telling you. Just come that close to death, that dry heaves and all that stuff, What a mess, I get up the next morning and I start, my God, I propositioned Margene last night. And I tried to fight Leroy. What am I going to do when I see them again? And then my next thought was, as sick as I was, I had a temperature, I felt like I had about 110 temperature. Every time my heart would beat, I thought my head would explode. And my next thought was, I need to get to the pool hall and thank those guys because I want to do that again. I almost died 3 hours earlier, But that was the beginning. That was probably my best night drinking. From there on, it just kind of took. I just always kind of wondered what a social drink is really. What is that? I missed out. Just missed out. When you're 15 years old, you can't drink every day, so all of a sudden I got interested in camping. I went back to school. I told my little buddies so we started saving our money, and we'd go to the river and camp out, and we'd find something to drink. And sometimes it's hard to get, and we were right down. We about Thursday, and we had the money. We couldn't find anybody to buy it. And I said, hey, that new kid's mother works in the beer joint. I bet you he'll get us something. And so we asked him, and he said, yeah, I'll get you something. This is like 1960. We give this cat $20. You can buy a car with $20. And he comes back proudly toting a case of Metz beer. Anybody ever drink any Metz beer? See, there really is a God. That's bad stuff. Now, I'm telling you what. But it did the trick, That stuff was so bad, I sent it off and had it analyzed. I got the letter. It said, dear Mr. Linehan, we believe your horse has diabetes. Bad stuff. We just kind of, alcohol, like in Bill's story, alcohol became more and more important to me. And, I had a hard time in school. I could not read. I did the third grade 2 or 3 times. I told somebody the other day the longest 4 years of my life was the third grade. I still couldn't read. I was just wasting everybody's time, Oh, go on. We need a good wrestler. So they pushed me on, Maybe you can play a little football, But, had a lot of trouble, obviously, in school. It became a big discipline problem. I don't know if anybody noticed or not, but I never did quite grow into my ears like they promised. And I'm very sensitive about that. Hardly ever bring it up, But, when you're that age, you're 13, 14 years old, 15 years old, and someone points out that maybe your ears are a little extra large, And I can remember looking in the mirror, and I'd look at those ears, and then I'd look at my sister's ears, and in that split second there, those ears grew. And the more I concentrated, the bigger they'd get, I could just see myself out in the wind, those ears. But, it just craziness. I was in my senior year, supposedly, and we had a misunderstanding, and they kicked me out of school. And my parents begged me to go back I don't know how old I was by then, but I was old. I'd be going to high school. And anyway, I went back for my second senior year. If you do all the math on that, I did 14 years and never did graduate, you know. And but what happened was that they kicked me out, and that was fine with me. You know, I went out and got a job and left my little girlfriend back in school, and we were going to get married her senior year, and that was a couple of years away. And so off we went, you know. And she got pregnant, so we had to get married, and she. We had a little girl, and the little girl was premature. She weighed about 2 pounds, and that was a big problem back then. It's still a problem today, but not near like it was then. And she lived 18 hours, and I watched her take every breath that she took in this life. And after 18 hours, we lost her. And you know, it was. I don't know how selfish and self-centered, you know, a human being can become. But I never considered how that little girl's life or death affected anybody on this planet but me. Not the mother, not my mother that I had named the child after. It wasn't until I got here that I looked at that for what it was. We had an alcoholic marriage. We'd bust up and go back together, bust up. She'd get an attorney and I'd talk her out of it. And we'd get back together and then we'd bust up and she'd moved in with her mother and dad. And after a couple of weeks, I gave up and I went and moved in with them too. Crazy. We did that for 4 years. I mean, I wore out some good clothes just dragging them up and down the street, you know. No, we finally able to get a divorce, and that came at a great time because my girlfriend was pregnant. And now come on, I got 40 minutes to get this in here. I got a lot of kids to tell you about here. So I get a divorce, marry this little gal, you know, and I have a little son. And I thought that's it, you know. I'll have a little boy. I can come home from work and play ball. You all know that never happened. Never happened. You know, it overwhelmed me, the idea of being responsible for this wife and this child. And, you know, I wanted out of the marriage, and before I could get out, she got pregnant the second time. And I thought, my God, I got to get away from this woman, you know. So we get a divorce, and that came at a great time because my girlfriend was pregnant. You know? I can shorten this up considerably. I was telling somebody at dinner tonight, 10 days ago, all my 3 oldest sons were all 55 years old. Did you hear Julie? She said, that creep slept in my house one time. Anyway, I had 5 kids by 4 different women in 34 months. Now, that doesn't make me alcoholic, but I always thought Jerry Springer missed out on a good story out of it. May 1968, I wandered in the doors of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I don't know about you all, but I walked into a glum lot. That's 4 of the oldest human beings I'd ever seen in my life. My God. And back then, they didn't talk about one day at a time. They talked about not drinking forever. If you're 23 years old, that's a long path to look down, you know. Looking back on it, they were all in their mid-late 40s, you know. But anyway, I couldn't stay. You know, I identified with them. I didn't understand exactly what they were talking about, but I knew that my drinking looked a whole lot like what they were talking about. They never talked about my drinking, and that's what I loved about it. That was the first place I'd ever been that they didn't talk about my drinking. They talked about their drinking and gave me the opportunity to identify with. I wish I'd have stayed because the best was yet to come. I mean, I had some difficulty with the law, and nothing serious to start. And, I got, I don't know, public drunk and, assault and battery, and then a maiming charge. And you know what that is? That's where you use something you shouldn't use on somebody and it marks them, like a beer bottle, And I'll tell you a typical night for me and where things really began to get in bad shape. I started out up here. And 21 years old, I was on top of the world in the car sales. And I didn't know it or anybody else that I had peaked out at 21 years old. From that point forward, everything just went south. We beginning to. I'd gotten a job with a little construction company, and the guy said, "I'll pick you up at 6 o'clock in the morning." I thought, well, probably I'll go to the beer joint, but I need to get something to eat. So I get something to eat, and I thought, well, I'll just go by and maybe play a game of pool and might drink a beer or two. I got overserved, and I got in a fight. And somehow I know this guy that I got in a fight with ended up in the trunk of my car. Now, I'm a blackout drinker, so I can't remember I got him. You know what I mean? I'll be driving around, I hear something in the back, I got something. Before I can figure out what to do with him, I black out again, So it was a long night for both of us, Anyway, make long story short, I didn't kill him or nothing. I just opened the trunk and walked off, and I presume he ran off, I got a 3-year deal on that thing. I was lucky. You just don't do that, They call that kidnapping in Oklahoma. Anyway, before I could live that 3 years down, I'm passed out, I'm certain. I hear my front door go down, and I remember being thrown on the floor and handcuffed. And I was so drunk that I wasn't able to communicate with them. And this was like 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. It was almost noon the next day before I was coherent enough to know that I'd been charged with rape. And to this very moment, I want to get this clear. This very moment, I don't know whether you're looking at a guilty man or not. I had an attorney, and the first thing they ask you is what happened. I don't know. To this day, I don't know. I spent the entire summer in 1971 locked up. And I'll tell you a little story about it. I'd been in lots of little jails, but I'd never been in a big jail. And this thing was huge. And everybody's talking about Tuesday's visitation day. So everybody's getting all worked up and excited. And I had no idea I figured somebody'd come see you or something. But I kind of got worked up. Tuesday rolled around, and I'm looking out that little window, and I see my mother come in. I thought I knew she'd come. I'm her baby. And right behind her is my wife. And I thought, well, that's strange, but I'm glad she came. Then another wife come in. That ain't good. I look back over here, kind of went back over here, and I can see my girlfriend. And her husband standing behind her. My mother's about this tall, and she stands up there. She says, honey, I know there's been a terrible mistake. I'll have you out of there as soon as possible. I said, for God's sakes, don't do it today. Woo. I go back to Alcoholics Anonymous, the same 4 old men sitting there. And I just can't stay. I can't stay. And I, in this little dry time that I had, I'd met another woman. Can you believe that? And she worked in an apartment complex where I worked, and she was the manager, and I was the maintenance man. And she had invited me over for dinner, and I never would leave. You know, I had to marry her because she was wealthy. She had a car and a TV. And where I come from, that was wealth, you know. But we didn't get married, and I got drunk. I was sober when I met her. That was in the spring of 1972. And on a Monday morning, the idea came that, you know, if this God they're talking about is all powerful, surely he could help me moderate and just drink a little bit. And I drank a beer on Monday, and I went back to work, and I thought I got it. Tuesday, I had about 3 beers, and I went back to work, and I said, this is easy. Thursday, I'm drunk. And I went at it that spring until October. I'm a guy that I can go about 5 days, and then I'm so sick that I can't drink anymore. But then I've got that other thing hanging on me. If I don't drink, I'm going to go through DTs. And then you're in a fix. You know, you can't drink and you can't stop. And if you've ever experienced DTs, they're very therapeutic, you know. And you know that they're waiting. And just exactly what they told me in Alcoholics Anonymous, if you ever have them, the chances you have them again goes up immensely. And I had one little bout of DTs in the probation and parole office. And that was an experience. The guy told me to sit down, and I sat down, and I jumped up, and he said, what's wrong? And I said, well, I don't know. And he said, well, sit down. And I sat down, and I jumped back up. And he said, you know, have you ever done this? Just out of nowhere, you know. He said, finally, he said, what the hell's wrong with you? And I said, I don't know, you know. I think I might be alcoholic. And he said, my God, maybe we're getting somewhere. And anyway, I can't stay sober. I took a little construction job in the southern part of the state. I heard his former girlfriend, his favorite uncle, had passed away, and I knew that she'd want me to take her to the funeral. And so I get from southern part of the state to Edmond, Oklahoma. I show up at her house unannounced to take her to her uncle's funeral. And I was wearing a pair of cut-off blue jeans. You think that's funny? You'll see my legs. I went to a swimming pool one time in a swimming suit and cowboy boots. The guy told me I looked like a canary standing in shotgun shells. Not much to look at. But I hadn't shaved or bathed. And I showed up with her entire family to take her to a funeral. And when I walked up to her and she looked up at me, she touched me in a spot that I'd never been touched. I'd seen that look, and if you're an alcoholic, you'll know what I'm talking about. You know, there's disgust, there's anger, there's pity, there's every emotion known to the human in that look. And one more time I saw it. I turned and walked out of her house, walked across her front lawn, and I had those 2 thoughts. Today's the day for you to stop drinking. You know, at that point, I'd stood in front of judges twice on what could have been capital cases. I knew what the depth of fear was. But that thought, there was a tidal wave of fear came in behind that like nothing that I'd ever witnessed. And the next thought was, there's no way I could stop. I went back to those 4 old men. One of them was, every group's got one. He's kind of loud, and he seems to be in charge. A little bit, just rub you the wrong way. You know, every group's got them. don't want to pick on anybody or anything. But I had avoided this guy. Have you ever been at Sunday or church? Big old hangover, little preacher up here, and he's bringing it down, and you know he's talking right at you. You just want to slide down to that, you know. And every time that guy shared, that's the way I felt. I didn't like him. But I haven't been going back very long. This guy was a veterinarian, and for some reason, after the meeting, I walked up to him and I said, "Hey, Doc," I said, "you really think I'm an alcoholic?" He said, "Joe," he said, "here at Alcoholics Anonymous, we allow every man the dignity to figure that out for themselves based on the information laid out in the big book, Alcoholics Anonymous." He said, "I'm going to make an exception with you." He said, "I'm going to call you alcoholic. I'll figure out what is wrong with you." And the next thing I said, I'll promise you, it came from somewhere else. But maybe one of the most important questions I ever asked another human being. I said, "Would you help me? Would you be my sponsor?" And his response to that was, "I'd love to talk to you about that." And so I went to his office, I believe the following day, and he took me back there in the back and he laid it out, what it was to be a member of Alcoholics Anonymous, what he'd expect of me and what he'd be willing to do. And I agreed to those terms, not knowing that I was making a pact with the devil. But I was telling somebody before the meeting there, you know, there's something about that surrender. When everything inside of you says, no, 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 you say, "Yes, I will. I'll try." That's the beauty of the surrender. You know, I think for me, it's the difference. You know, I can't read, I can't write, you know, I'm a felon, I'm homeless, I'm, you know, disgusting, you know, and those four old men took me in and treated me like I was family. So I was really kind of sponsored by all of them, but Doc was my sponsor. He picked up right quick that I was illiterate. Only a handful of people, some very, very close to me, didn't know that. I was a master at getting around that. And we're sitting there in that veterinarian clinic, and he turned around and he said, "Joe, you can't read, can you?" And something inside of me, I don't know, I looked down, it was a white tile floor. And I said, "No, Doc, I can't read." And he said, "Well, boy, you're going to have to learn to read." And I thought, well, he said that with conviction, you know. I said, "I ain't doing nothing else. Let's read," you know. Couldn't buy a job, you know. So I learned to read back there with them dogs and cats and, you know, barking animals and what have you. But I learned to read with Field and Stream magazine, Popular Mechanics, and the big book, Alcoholics Anonymous. And I picked it up pretty good, pretty quick. And I remember I was 6-8 months sober, and Doc said, "Sunday night, I want you to read How It Works at the speaker meeting." I said, "You want me to read How It Works?" He said, "Yeah." Now this guy had accomplished everything he'd ever taken on. But I believe it was one of his proudest moments when I got up there before the speaker meeting and read How It Works. Now the speaker only had to talk about 20 minutes. You know, we only had one meeting a week in our little town. And so we had little different meetings around different little towns that we went to make up. And we would usually make about 6 meetings a week. And the 4 old men and me. And So amazing. I got a meeting going to the meeting. I got a meeting when I got there, and I got a meeting coming home. Greatest times of my life. Didn't have nothing, but didn't care. At that time, I just, and then I absolutely fell in love with Alcoholics Anonymous. I just, I was kind of barred from family reunions. I showed up nude at one of them. Speaking of nude, any rest of y'all, how many of you blacked out? How many? Oh, yeah. You woke up in embarrassing places. I come out of a blackout in a shower with a guy and a girl. And the woman was screaming, and the guy was laughing, thank God. I was defenseless, if you know what I mean. I had missed my apartment by one door. And when you live right next door to somebody, virtually right next door, it's hard to avoid them, The guy was pretty good natured. He said he never liked her anyway. It's oh my God. I was telling somebody I used to go around them old joints and somebody would come up and say, "Hey Joe, you got that 10 I got from you? I gave you last week?" I didn't know. I just had to give him $10 if I had it, And there was some cruel cat back there. He said, "No," I said, "Hell, I told him I paid you a week ago. Come on, just flip it around on him." But it's just the predicaments we get ourselves in. But that's one thing. But think of the weight of the family. My goodness, I married 5 great women. I'm still married to one of them. Maybe. I told her I was coming out here and she got her hair fixed. Was that scary? That tell you. Steve said, "What do you think about that?" I said, "Hell, at my age, all help's appreciated." Doc got me in that book, and he just laid things out, just step by step, and read to me, and he explained things to me, and then I got to where I could read, and it was a little bit different then. They take you through the first. In this case, he took me through the first 4 steps, and then I took my 5th step with a priest, and then I brought him my 8-step list, and he just gave me some ideas and told me to get it on. And then when I got halfway through, like the book says, he said, "You need to find somebody to help." And he'd call me down there and give me a case of books. And that time, it took a long time to get rid of a case of books, So I've got that, or I don't want one of those. But anyway, I went to all the doctors, I went to all the court people, I went to anybody that might run into an alcoholic, ministers, and told them about Alcoholics Anonymous, told them where we were, what we do. And it's a great time. It's a great time. I can't imagine life without it. Tell me that didn't happen. We had him right here, and you scared him off. I'm kind of Tom had that happen in prison, but I'm really bad about phones around my area, And I was in a meeting this winter, and I kept hearing this phone go off. I'm looking around. Hell, it's in my coat pocket. So be careful what you lay out there. You may have to eat some of it, I'm just so appreciative. Steve asked me to come out here. I'm so appreciative of our friendship. You know, uh, you know, in Alcoholics Anonymous says we form lifelong friendships. The first guy that I ever brought home, a kid named Christopher Vela, just celebrated 50 years. And I gave him an ultimatum at the airport. I said, you can go home with me and go to Alcoholics Anonymous, or you can get out of this car and get back on another plane. It's your choice. Don't ever call me again. He said, I'll go with you. And we had more fun. He's about this tall. And I went home one day, and he was supposed to be reading the big book. If I wasn't there, he's supposed to be reading the book. He'd seen it come. I said, come on, Chris, we got a 12-step call. My mom had called me about a lady in Al-Anon's husband's. Said, he's ready. So I knew what street he lived on, but I didn't know the actual address. I had this new guy with me, and he still just, and I got this old car. It's all wore out. You got to drive it, you know what I mean? We start down this street, and I'm looking, I don't even know what I was looking at. And Chris said, he lives right there. And I said, how would you know that? And he said, well, look at that car. And it was hit everywhere but on the radio knob. And we went up and knocked on the door, so help me God, it was Jerry. And two morons went in there and told him our experience, and Jerry just died with 40 years sobriety. Better than that, because Chris got 50. So, you don't ever know. Like I said, we couldn't put two sentences together, but we got a message over that guy. And I think if nothing else, it was enthusiasm that we were experiencing from our introduction to Alcoholics Anonymous. Tom always said that was the most contagious thing we had, was enthusiasm for a new way of life. You see, I believe that we have the opportunity that only a handful of people get to experience. I'm talking about worldwide, all people. We have the opportunity to live two entirely different lives. Our book says we're reborn. People say, well, I hate that this happened or that happened. All that had to happen in order for me to get to that point on that day that I'd say, I'm beat and I know it. And God could enter my heart. Bill Wilson told Ann Smith, God's either entered his heart or he hadn't. No matter what had happened or wouldn't happen, that was going to happen for me on that day. The only thing I got to do is keep that alive. Keep that conscious contact. See, I thought conscious contact was being full of all this other stuff. But I believe for me, all it is me being conscious, constant consciousness of the presence of a power working in my life. Thank you all.